He threw the deadbolt. The loud clack echoed in the small space. I had known Gary Evans for 30 years. We had fished the Gulf Coast together, buried our wives in the same cemetery, and shared countless quiet beers on my back porch. I knew his face like I knew my own. And right now, Gary was pale, sweating, and shaking. He did not look at me as he turned his computer monitor around. He just stared at the floor and said in a voice I had never heard him use before, "Richard, you need to listen to me very carefully. Cancel your bank cards right now. Change your safe passwords the minute you leave here. And whatever you do, do not go back to that house tonight." I stood there in the dusty air of his shop, surrounded by the smell of soldering iron and old circuit boards, trying to process the sheer gravity of his words. My name is Richard Stanton. I am 70 years old. For 4 decades, I built a logistics and warehousing empire across the state of Texas from the very ground up. I started with one beat-up freight truck and a lot of sweat, and I turned it into a multi-million-dollar operation. I have negotiated with cutthroat union bosses, navigated 3 devastating economic crises, and sat across the table from men who would smile while trying to ruin my entire life. I am not a fragile old man. I am not someone who gets easily spooked. Yet standing in that dimly lit room staring at the shattered screen of a cell phone connected to Gary diagnostic software, I felt my knees actually go weak. To understand how I ended up hiding in the back room of a tech shop staring at a living nightmare, you have to know exactly what happened just 2 hours earlier. It had started out as a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning. I was sitting at the kitchen island of the massive $3 million mansion in Westlake Hills, a house I had gladly paid 80% of the down payment for, so my son Derek and his wife Natalie could have their ultimate dream home. I had moved in with them 2 years ago after selling my logistics company and having a mild health scare involving my heart. They insisted I live with them. They told me I deserved to rest, to enjoy the fruits of my lifelong labor surrounded by family. I was sipping my black coffee, reading the local morning paper. Derek had already left for his job at a downtown investment fund. He had looked terrible lately. He was exhausted, pale, losing weight, and constantly rubbing his temples as if fighting a perpetual migraine. He always brushed it off as work stress, and I had believed him. Natalie, on the other hand, was pacing around the kitchen island. She runs what she calls a high-end event planning company. She is 35, always dressed impeccably, always wearing a perfect rehearsed smile that never quite reached her eyes. But this morning the facade was slipping. She was on a phone call, and her voice was unusually strained. She was whispering frantically into her phone, completely absorbed in her anxious conversation. I did not mean to startle her. I simply stood up to put my empty coffee mug into the stainless steel sink. The sudden scrape of my wooden stool against the tile floor echoed loudly. Natalie spun around, her eyes wide with sheer panic. The sudden movement caught her off guard, and her pristine smartphone slipped from her manicured fingers. It hit the edge of the granite counter with a sharp crack and crashed down onto the hard marble floor. Natalie gasped loudly and dropped to her knees, scooping up the device with trembling hands. The screen was completely shattered, black, and entirely unresponsive. She started hyperventilating, a physical reaction that seemed entirely out of proportion for a broken piece of technology. She clutched the dead phone to her chest, pacing the kitchen floor, and muttering about how she was completely ruined. I walked over and tried to calm her down. I told her gently that it was just a phone and that we could go get it replaced in an hour. But she looked at me with wild, terrified eyes, yelling that it was not just a phone. She claimed it held vital, unbacked-up client data for a massive corporate event she was coordinating that very night. She said if she lost that specific data, her business would be sued into absolute bankruptcy. Seeing my daughter-in-law in such severe distress, my paternal instincts immediately kicked in. I told her to take a deep breath and let me handle it. I told her I knew the absolute best tech guy in Austin, my old buddy Gary, a former cybersecurity expert who ran a small repair shop to keep his mind sharp in retirement. I offered to drive the phone over to him immediately so he could extract the data while she used my spare phone to manage the crisis. At first, she violently hesitated. She gripped the broken phone tightly against her chest, looking at me with an intense mix of deep suspicion and sheer desperation. But the screen was dead, the power would not turn on, and she had no other choice. She handed it over slowly, making me promise to tell Gary not to look at any personal files, just to back up the raw data and fix the display. I smiled warmly, told her not to worry about a thing, and drove off, feeling like a helpful father. Now, 2 hours later, that helpful father feeling was dead and buried. Gary had hooked the broken phone up to his specialized extraction software to bypass the damaged display and pull the encrypted backup directly from the motherboard. But Gary's software is incredibly thorough. It does not just pull contacts and family photos. It pulls absolutely everything. It bypasses passwords. It pulls deleted files. It extracts hidden messaging applications that most people do not even know exist. I looked at Gary's pale, frightened face, then back at the large, glowing computer monitor. "What did you find, Gary?" I asked, my voice barely a raspy whisper. "What happened?" He swallowed hard, his hands physically trembling as he pointed a grease-stained finger at the screen. "Look at the text, recovery logs. Richard, just read them yourself." I leaned in closer, pulling my reading glasses from my shirt pocket and sliding them onto my face. The messages were from an encrypted, unnamed contact simply saved in her phone as a single initial. They were time-stamped from late last night, just hours before Natalie had dropped the phone in the kitchen. The glowing white words blurred for a fraction of a second before coming into sharp, horrifying focus. The first message from the unknown sender read, "We cannot wait another month. The accounts are perfectly primed on my end. You need to finalize the power of attorney documents this week before he talks to his broker again." Then Natalie reply from last night, "I am trying. But Derek is stalling, and the old man is asking questions about the $200,000 stream I moved on Monday. He is starting to snoop around the floor, safe in his room." My breath caught sharply in my throat. $200,000. I had noticed a glaring discrepancy in my joint investment account with Derek. Just yesterday afternoon, a massive withdrawal I had assumed was a routine bank error. I had casually asked them about it at dinner, and they had smoothly brushed it off with a smile. But it was the final message on the screen, the one from the unknown contact, that made the blood freeze entirely in my veins and the small dusty room start to spin out of control. It read, "Do not let him check those accounts. You know exactly what to do. Accelerate the dosage in their morning drinks. Keep Derek compliant and make sure the old man loses his mind faster. If he asks again, double the drops. Accelerate the dosage. Make sure the old man loses his mind faster." I stared at those glowing digital letters until they burned themselves permanently into my retinas. The sudden, inexplicable brain fog I had been fighting. The sudden tremors in my hands that I thought were just old age. The way my son Derek walked around the house like a heavily medicated ghost, unable to string a coherent sentence together after breakfast. It was not old age. It was not work stress. The woman I had welcomed into my family with open arms, the woman whose $3 million roof I had happily paid for, was methodically and deliberately poisoning my son and me. I had to protect my son. I had to protect myself. And I had to do it before she realized I knew everything. I took a deep breath, looked at Gary, and told him to wipe the logs. The hunt was on. I stepped out of Gary Tech Shop. For 4 decades, I sat across boardroom tables from men who would gladly watch my logistics company burn to make a profit. I knew how to wear a mask. I knew how to bury my rage so deep that not a flicker showed in my eyes. I climbed into my car, gripped the steering wheel, and forced my breathing to slow down. I had to be the clueless old man they thought I was. If Natalie suspected I had read those text messages, I did not know what she might do next. The drive back to Westlake Hills felt like a journey into a war zone. I pulled into the driveway of the $3 million estate, parked my car, and grabbed the prepaid smartphone. I walked through the heavy oak front doors and found Natalie pacing in the grand foyer. She spun around when she heard my footsteps, her eyes darting to my hands. I gave her a grandfatherly smile and handed her the prepaid phone. I told her the drop had completely shattered the display connectors. I explained that Gary said the motherboard was still intact, but he needed a few days to extract the client data without corrupting the files. I told her he gave me this temporary replacement so she could make calls and manage her business. I watched her face closely. I expected to see a flash of panic, a twitch of guilt, but Natalie was a good actress. She let out a dramatic sigh of relief, placing a hand over her heart. She thanked me profusely, calling me her lifesaver, and gave me a brief hug. She took the phone and hurried off to her office, complaining about how much catching up she had to do. I watched her walk away, feeling a knot twist in my stomach. She was unfazed. That evening, the three of us sat down for dinner. The crystal chandelier cast a warm glow over the table, illuminating the roasted salmon and organic vegetables Natalie had prepared. To any outside observer, we looked like the perfect American family, enjoying a quiet, weeknight meal. But the reality sitting across from me was deeply disturbing. Derek looked worse than he had this morning. His skin was pale and waxy. He barely touched his food. He kept rubbing his eyes, looking as though he had not slept a full night in weeks. I waited until the plates were nearly empty before I set my trap. I dabbed my mouth with a napkin, put on my most casual, slightly confused expression, and cleared my throat. I mentioned that I had been on the phone with my private wealth manager earlier, going over some routine portfolio balancing. I kept my tone light, almost apologetic, as I brought up the joint family investment account. I looked directly at Derek and asked if he knew anything about a $200,000 withdrawal that had cleared on Monday. The air in the room seemed to stand still. I watched Natalie out of the corner of my eye. Most guilty people would flinch. They would drop their fork, avert their gaze, or suddenly find their water glass incredibly interesting. Natalie did none of those things. She did not miss a beat. She calmly took a sip of her sparkling water, set the glass down with delicate precision, and smiled warmly at me. She then turned her gaze to her husband, her expression a perfect portrait of supportive concern. Derek stopped rubbing his temples and let out a long, heavy sigh. He looked at me with an expression that broke my heart. It was a mix of sheer exhaustion and mild irritation, the kind of look a parent gives a child who has asked the same question for the third time. He placed his fork on his plate and leaned forward. "Dad, we went over this last week," Derek said, his voice thick with fatigue. "It is the seed money for the commercial real estate flip over on the east side. The warehouse conversion project I showed you the blueprints for. We needed liquid capital to secure the escrow before the other developers swooped in." I stared at him, keeping my face carefully blank. I had absolutely no memory of any warehouse conversion project. I had not seen any blueprints. I built my fortune in commercial warehousing. I would never drop $200,000 into a flip without conducting massive due diligence. But Derek spoke with such absolute conviction, such weary certainty, that I knew he genuinely believed what he was saying. I frowned, playing my part. I told him I did not recall having that conversation, and I certainly did not remember authorizing a transfer of that magnitude from our joint funds. Natalie reached across the table and rested her hand over Derek's arm. She looked at me with a sickeningly sweet smile, her eyes filled with fake sympathy. "Richard, do not worry yourself over it," she said softly. "You have a lot on your mind lately. It is perfectly normal to forget a few details here and there. We are taking care of everything just like we promised." I ignored her and kept my eyes fixed on my son. I asked him how the bank had even approved a withdrawal of that size without my direct verbal confirmation or my physical signature on the authorization forms. Derek rubbed his face with both hands, looking more drained than I had ever seen him. "Dad, you signed the authorization transfer yourself," he said, his words slurred. "We sat right here at this table last Thursday and signed the paperwork together. You gave the bank your approval." The room seemed to shrink around me. I had not signed anything. I was certain of it. But the sheer confidence in my son voice meant that either my signature had been masterfully forged, or I had been in such a deep chemical fog that I had blindly signed away a fortune without retaining a single memory. I forced myself to look confused, letting my shoulders slump to complete the illusion of a failing old man. I muttered that I must be getting terribly forgetful in my old age. Derek gave me a sympathetic yet deeply troubling look. "It is not just old age, Dad," he said quietly. "Dr. Aris warned us your memory would slip after your medication adjustment. He said the new dosage might cause some mild cognitive blocks until your system gets used to it. We just need to be patient." My blood ran completely cold. I felt a chill spread from the base of my neck all the way down my spine. I had not seen a doctor in 8 months. I did not have a doctor named Aris. And I absolutely did not have any sort of medication adjustment. I realized in that terrifying instant the true depth of Natalie's monstrous plan. She was not just stealing my money. She was poisoning us, forging documents, and orchestrating a massive gaslighting campaign to convince my son that I was losing my mind, all while feeding him the exact same poison. The realization hit me with the force of a speeding freight train. I excused myself from the dinner table as quickly as I possibly could, claiming that my new daily medication was making me unusually tired. I climbed the grand curving staircase to my bedroom, my heart hammering painfully against my ribs. Once I was safely inside with the heavy wooden door securely locked behind me, I walked over to the bathroom mirror and tightly gripped the edges of the cold marble vanity. I stared at my own reflection, searching for the strong man who had built a massive logistics empire from nothing, and instead, I saw an old man who had been slowly, methodically robbed of his own mind. The conflict was no longer just about stolen money or hidden accounts. It was a dark poison coursing through my very veins. I raised my hands and held them out in front of my face. They were trembling uncontrollably. For the past 3 weeks, I had been waking up with a dense, suffocating fog clouding my brain. I had been feeling a bone-deep lethargy that made it incredibly difficult to string complex thoughts together or remember simple conversations from the day before. I had convinced myself it was just the inevitable decline of aging, a cruel but completely natural fading of my cognitive faculties. I had even felt a quiet, shameful panic that my brilliant mind was finally failing me after all these years. But now, looking at my shaking fingers, the truth was an icy block in my stomach. It was not early dementia. It was not old age. I was being chemically subdued in my own home. I had to know exactly how deep this terrifying nightmare truly went. Later that night, long after the massive house had fallen completely silent, I quietly crept out of my bedroom. I needed a glass of water, but more importantly, I needed to observe my immediate surroundings with my eyes wide open. The polished hardwood floors were cold under my bare feet as I slowly made my way down the lengthy hallway. A faint sliver of light spilled out from beneath the heavy oak door of the main home office. I moved silently toward it and cautiously peeked through the narrow crack. Derek was sitting at his massive mahogany desk, bathed in the harsh blue light of his bright computer monitors. What I saw completely broke my heart and fueled my rapidly rising anger. My ambitious, vibrant son, the brilliant financial mind, who expertly managed millions of dollars a day, looked like a walking corpse. His skin was dangerously pale, almost translucent in the dim room. His cheekbones jutted out sharply, revealing a recent, alarming weight loss. I had somehow failed to fully register until this very moment. He was staring blankly at a complex financial spreadsheet, his eyes vacant and entirely unfocused. He would slowly type a few numbers, rub his temples in obvious agony, and then just silently stare at the blank wall for several minutes at a time. He looked like a hollow, broken shell of the strong, confident man I had proudly raised. This was not a malicious son deliberately plotting against his own father to steal a massive fortune. This was a completely helpless prisoner. Natalie was systematically destroying his health, breaking down his mental defenses, so she could freely use his signature and his executive authority without facing any resistance. I retreated to my room in the dark, my profound sadness rapidly transforming into a cold, calculated, and absolute fury. I barely slept a single wink that night. When the bright morning sun finally broke through the large bedroom windows, I already had a defensive plan fully forming in my awakened mind. I dressed slowly and carefully, made my way down to the kitchen, carrying a stainless steel travel thermos, discreetly tucked inside the deep inner pocket of my thick morning jacket. Natalie was already standing at the massive kitchen island, humming a cheerful tune as she busily prepared our morning breakfast. Her morning routine had always seemed like a deeply loving gesture, a dedicated wife making sure her family started the busy day right. She was operating an expensive blender, thoroughly mixing fresh kale protein powder and dark berries. I sat at the counter and watched her every single move like a hungry hawk watching its prey. She poured the thick green mixture into 3 separate glass tumblers. But I noticed a crucial, chilling detail I had never once paid attention to before this morning. She turned her back to me for just a few short seconds to reach into the walk-in pantry. When she turned back around, she quickly slid one specific glass toward Derek's empty chair and another specific glass directly toward me. She picked up the 3rd glass for herself and took a large, refreshing gulp. "Good morning, Richard," she said brightly. "Drink up. It has extra antioxidants today to help with your energy levels." I smiled my most convincing grandfatherly smile and thanked her profusely. As soon as she turned around to check on the cooking eggs, I swiftly dumped the entire contents of my glass into the hidden thermos in my jacket, leaving just a thin green film at the very bottom. I set the empty glass down on the counter and wiped my mouth with a paper napkin, just as Derek shuffled into the kitchen. He looked completely drained, moving with a sluggish, mechanical stiffness. He grunted a quiet good morning, heavily slumped into the tall wooden stool next to mine, and blindly reached for the specific glass Natalie had intentionally placed in front of him. He drank the dark green mixture in continuous, exhausted gulps, desperate for any kind of energy. I sat there in total silence and closely observed him with a terrifying clarity. It did not take long for the hidden poison to fully take hold. Within 20 minutes, the subtle but undeniable physical transformation finally began. The lingering tension in Derek's broad shoulders completely vanished, replaced by a strange, unnatural looseness that made him look like a puppet with recently cut strings. He blinked slowly, his eyelids looking heavy and drooping. When he weakly tried to speak about his morning meetings, his words were slurred, dragging together as if his tongue were suddenly too large for his dry mouth. His typically sharp analytical gaze became completely dull, glassy, and blindly compliant. Natalie walked over to him, her expensive high heels clicking softly on the polished marble floor. She placed a perfectly manicured hand on his shoulder and slid a thick manila folder across the cold granite counter. "Derek, honey," she murmured in a soothing, highly hypnotic voice. "I just need your signature on these tax authorization forms for the real estate broker. It is just routine paperwork, but they absolutely need it filed by noon today." Derek did not read a single line of printed text. He did not ask a single logical question about it. He simply blinked, his heavy eyes picked up the silver fountain pen she handed him, and blindly signed his name at the bottom of the page. I watched as Derek blindly signed his name at the bottom of the page. The silver pen glinted in the morning light, leaving a trail of dark blue ink that effectively signed away a piece of our family legacy. Natalie deftly slid the manila folder back across the granite counter, snapping it shut with a crisp, efficient sound. She patted Derek on the shoulder, offering him a hollow word of encouragement, before turning her attention back to her own smoothie. Derek just sat there, staring blankly at the wall, completely devoid of the sharp intellect that had made him a top-tier fund manager. I had seen enough. My heart was a cold, heavy stone in my chest. I quietly excused myself from the kitchen, claiming that the new daily medication was making my stomach a bit unsettled and that I needed to lie down for a while. Natalie did not even bother to look up from her phone, as she offered a dismissive nod. I walked up the grand, curving staircase, my steps measured and deliberately slow. Once I reached the privacy of my own bedroom, I locked the heavy mahogany door and walked directly to the massive walk-in closet. Hidden beneath a heavy Persian rug was my personal floor safe. It was a high-end biometric and keypad model, a habit I had picked up during my decades running the logistics business. Inside that steel box was the entirety of my most sensitive personal information. It held my comprehensive medical records, the original copies of my final will, the deeds to my remaining commercial properties, and the physical stock certificates from the sale of my company. I knelt on the plush carpet, pulled back the heavy rug, and confidently punched in the 6-digit code I had used for the past 10 years. It was the date I had married my late wife. The safe emitted a harsh, short electronic beep. A red light flashed on the digital display. I paused, thinking my trembling fingers had simply slipped. I carefully typed the numbers a second time, pressing each key with deliberate force. Beep. Red light. Denied. A wave of icy dread washed over me. I placed my right thumb on the biometric scanner, hoping the digital keypad was merely malfunctioning. The scanner glowed green for a second before flashing red. Access denied. My fingerprints had been completely wiped from the system. Natalie had completely locked me out of my own life. I stood up, my aging knees aching slightly, and pulled my prepaid smartphone from my inner jacket pocket. I needed to know the exact extent of the perimeter she had built around me. I dialed the direct private line of my wealth manager at the bank downtown. I had known the man for 15 long years. We had played golf together. I expected him to sound concerned, perhaps even surprised to hear from me on an unlisted number. Instead, his voice was unnervingly cheerful and completely professional. "Good morning, Richard," he said warmly. "It is so wonderful to hear your voice. I hope you are resting well at home." I skipped the pleasantries and immediately asked him to verify the current status of my primary liquid accounts and why I had not received my quarterly statements in the mail. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, followed by the sound of fingers tapping rapidly on a computer keyboard. "Well, Richard, we processed the change of address you submitted last month," he explained smoothly. "Per your notarized request, all of your bank statements, legal alerts, and tax documents have been permanently rerouted to Natalie Business Post Office Box." She explained that she is helping you manage your daily paperwork so you can focus entirely on your health. "We also successfully filed the comprehensive power of attorney documents you sent over. Is there something you need me to look into?" I felt the room begin to violently tilt. Power of attorney. Notarized requests. I politely thanked my banker, claiming my memory was just playing harmless tricks on me, and ended the call before my rising panic could seep into my voice. I walked over to the massive bay windows of my bedroom and looked out over the sprawling estate. The rolling green hills of Westlake Hills stretched out beneath the bright Texas sun. I had proudly paid 80% of the massive down payment for this magnificent property. I had poured a massive portion of my lifelong savings into these sturdy brick walls and expensive slate roofs because I wanted my son to have the absolute perfect home. Now, looking out at the immaculate landscaping and the shimmering blue water of the infinity pool, the truth was an agonizing weight on my shoulders. This $3 million mansion was not a warm, inviting home. It was a meticulously constructed, beautifully decorated, and incredibly isolated prison. I had spent 40 years building a massive logistics empire from nothing. I had commanded vast fleets of freight trucks across the entire country, managed hundreds of tough, uncompromising employees, and amassed a formidable fortune through sheer willpower and relentless grind. Now I was completely cut off from the outside world. I had no access to my own money, no access to my private medical history, and absolutely no legal control over my own hard-earned assets. I was a helpless captive in a golden cage, slowly and methodically being erased by the smiling woman currently sipping a green smoothie in the kitchen directly below me. Just as the crushing reality of my absolute isolation fully settled over me, I heard the distinct chime of the front gate intercom echoing loudly from the main hallway. I quickly moved to the window and saw a dark delivery van idling patiently in the wide circular driveway. A professional courier stepped out of the vehicle holding a thick, oversized legal envelope securely under his right arm. I knew Natalie was currently busy in the back garden dealing with the weekly pool maintenance crew. This was my one and only chance to intercept the delivery. I hurried out of my room and quietly made my way down the long staircase, moving much faster than I had in several months. I reached the heavy front doors just as the courier raised his hand to knock firmly on the thick wood. I opened the door, offered a perfectly polite smile, and quickly signed the electronic pad with my index finger. I took the heavy envelope and eagerly looked at the return address printed in bold black ink in the upper left corner. It was from a highly prominent, incredibly ruthless law firm located right in the heart of downtown Austin. But it was the specific department name printed just below the main corporate logo that made my heart completely stop beating in my chest. The envelope had been sent directly from the Department of Adult Conservatorship and Involuntary Guardianship. I stood perfectly still in the quiet hallway as the terrifying reality washed over me. She was not just stealing my fortune. She was legally erasing my entire existence while I was still breathing. I shoved the envelope inside my jacket and hurried up the stairs before Natalie or Derek found me. Inside my room, I slid the legal document under my mattress. My hands balled into fists. A conservatorship meant she was actively building a legal case to declare me incompetent. She wanted a judge to hand her total control over my finances, my health care, and my basic human rights. I needed to see exactly how she was gathering her so-called evidence and accessing my active accounts to fund this elaborate scheme. I needed to catch her in the absolute act. That evening, I decided to lay a trap. I walked into the dining room, rubbing my temples dramatically, squinting against the bright chandelier light. I told Derek and Natalie that I was suffering from a blinding, splitting headache. I played the part of the frail, deteriorating old man flawlessly. I let my voice tremble slightly. I allowed my shoulders to slump heavily as I sat down. Natalie's face immediately adopted that sickeningly sweet mask of fake concern. She rushed to my side, placing a cool hand on my shoulder, and told me that she would bring my dinner upstairs, along with a fresh green smoothie to help me sleep through the night. I thanked her weakly and retreated to my room. When she brought the tray up 20 minutes later, I waited until she closed the door. Then I quietly dumped the thick green liquid straight down the bathroom sink and flushed it away with hot water. I lay down on top of the covers, fully clothed. I made sure to leave the heavy bedroom door unlocked, leaving a gap just wide enough for someone to slip through silently. The stakeout had officially begun. I lay there in the suffocating darkness of my own home, waiting for the predator to strike. The hours dragged on with an agonizing, frustrating slowness. I watched the glowing red digits of my digital alarm clock shift from 10 to midnight, then to 1 in the morning. The sprawling mansion settled into a heavy silence. I could hear the faint hum of the central air conditioning and the distant rustle of the wind against the bay windows. Every muscle in my aging body screamed in protest from holding the rigid, motionless posture. I forced my breathing into a slow, rhythmic pattern, inhaling and exhaling to mimic the slumber of a medicated man. My eyes were closed, but I left the narrowest slit open, allowing me to monitor the dark outline of the bedroom door. Just as the red digits flipped to exactly 2 in the morning, I heard a faint, almost imperceptible click. The brass handle of my bedroom door slowly rotated downward. The heavy wood groaned softly on its hinges as the door was pushed open. A sliver of pale yellow light from the hallway spilled across the carpet. A tall shadow slipped into the room. It was Natalie. She moved with practiced, terrifying silence, her bare feet making absolutely no sound on the thick floor rugs. She stood perfectly still by the doorway, just watching me. I kept my chest rising and falling in a steady, heavy rhythm. I even let out a soft, ragged snore to complete the illusion. Apparently satisfied that her toxic smoothie had done its dark work, she began to glide across the room toward my bed. My heart pounded so violently against my ribs that I was certain she would hear it echoing in the quiet room. The faint floral scent of her expensive perfume hit my nose, turning my stomach into a hard knot of absolute disgust. She was standing right beside my mattress, looming over me like a vulture circling a wounded animal. She leaned entirely over my nightstand. The proximity was suffocating. I could hear the soft, rhythmic sound of her shallow breathing. She reached out and silently picked up my digital tablet, the device I used for all my secure personal banking and private email correspondence. The screen was protected by a complex alphanumeric password and a strict biometric fingerprint lock. I watched through my narrowly slitted eyes as she pressed the power button. The screen illuminated her face in a harsh, cold, bluish glow, highlighting the sharp angles of her cheekbones and the utter lack of emotion in her dark eyes. She did not even attempt to guess the typed password. Instead, she turned her attention directly to my resting body. She reached out with cold, calculating fingers and gently took hold of my right hand, which was resting limply on top of the bed covers. The physical contact made my skin crawl with pure, visceral revulsion, but I forced every nerve and tendon in my arm to remain completely dead and unresponsive. I let my hand act as dead weight as she carefully lifted it toward the glowing screen. She guided my thumb and pressed it firmly against the biometric scanner on the bottom of the device. The tablet immediately chirped a soft, quiet chime, granting her full, unrestricted access to my entire digital life. I watched in silent horror as her fingers began flying rapidly across the glass screen. She opened my primary investment portfolio. She was navigating the complex interface with the speed and precision of someone who had done this exact routine dozens of times before. She quickly initiated a massive wire transfer, moving funds from my secure liquid holdings into an external routing account I did not recognize. She was literally draining my life savings right in front of my face, confident that I was too sedated to ever wake up and stop her. After securing the transfer, she swiftly deleted the banking notification emails that had automatically popped up on the screen, erasing any immediate digital trace of her late-night theft. She carefully set the tablet back down on the wooden nightstand, placing it in the exact position and angle I had left it in. She gently lowered my right hand back onto the mattress, arranging my fingers to look perfectly undisturbed. I continued my slow, heavy breathing, fighting the overwhelming urge to reach up, grab her wrist, and demand to know what she had done to my son. She stood over me for one final moment, looking down at my supposedly unconscious face. A cold, arrogant smirk twisted the corners of her mouth. She leaned in slightly, and in a low, mocking whisper that barely carried over the hum of the air conditioner, she said, "Just a few more weeks, you stubborn old piggy bank." Then she turned around, glided silently across the thick carpet, and slipped out the bedroom door, pulling it shut with a soft, final click. I lay alone in the dark, the sweet floral stench of her perfume still lingering heavily in the cold air. The profound sadness that had consumed me all day instantly evaporated, burned away by a sudden flash of pure, unadulterated rage. She thought she was dealing with a frail, oblivious, easily manipulated victim. She had no idea she had just awakened a determined man who knew exactly how to completely destroy empires from the ground up. I lay awake as the first gray light of dawn slowly crept through the heavy bedroom curtains. The raw anger burning inside my chest was a powerful living thing, urging me to march down the hallway, kick open their bedroom door, and demand every single dollar back. But 40 years in the brutal world of corporate logistics had taught me that acting on pure, unbridled emotion was the fastest way to lose a war. If I confronted Natalie now, she would instantly play the victim. She would quietly delete the wire transfer records, dispose of her hidden phones, and flush the tainted smoothies down the drain. She would look at my son with perfectly simulated tears and tell him that my mental state had completely fractured, that I was suffering from paranoid delusions. And Derek, locked in his chemical fog, would absolutely believe her. I realized that my greatest weapon was not a sudden confrontation. My greatest weapon was her own arrogance. She desperately wanted me to be a broken, senile old man. I decided it was time to give her the greatest performance of my life. I waited until I heard the familiar hum of the kitchen blender before I made my way downstairs. My posture was deliberately hunched. I shuffled my feet across the hardwood floors, letting my slippers drag with a heavy, uncoordinated rhythm. When I entered the bright kitchen, Natalie was pouring the green smoothies, and Derek was slumped over his coffee mug, staring blankly at a financial newspaper. I walked over to the cabinet, my hands shaking, with a carefully practiced tremor. I reached for a heavy ceramic coffee mug. Just as my fingers brushed the smooth handle, I intentionally let my grip completely fail. The thick mug plummeted to the floor, shattering into dozens of sharp, jagged pieces against the hard marble tiles. The loud, violent crash echoed through the quiet house. Derek flinched heavily, rubbing his face with a tired groan. Natalie spun around, her eyes flashing with a brief moment of genuine annoyance before she quickly plastered on her usual mask of pity. I stood there staring at the broken pieces, forcing my breathing to become shallow and panicked. I looked up at Natalie, letting my eyes glaze over with a deep, vacant confusion. I stepped toward her, reaching out a trembling hand. "Martha," I whispered, using my late wife name. "Martha, the boys at the loading dock are going to be late. Did you call the dispatcher?" Natalie froze. She exchanged a swift, triumphant look with my son. Derek stood up his chair, scraping loudly against the floor. He walked over and gently took my arm, his voice thick with profound sadness. "Dad, it is me, Derek. Mom has been gone for years." I looked at him, contorting my facial features into a mask of pure, unadulterated bewilderment. I gripped his sleeve tightly. "Derek," I stammered, my voice cracking perfectly. "Derek, what year is it? Why are we not at the old house?" My son closed his eyes, a look of absolute devastation washing over his pale face. He guided me to a chair, whispering soft, useless reassurances. I kept my head bowed, playing the tragic victim, but beneath the table my hands were perfectly steady. The results of my morning performance were immediate and astonishingly effective. Natalie Guard did not just drop. It completely vanished. By convincing her that her toxic chemical cocktail was working exactly as planned, I effectively rendered myself invisible in my own home. I was no longer a wealthy investor to be managed. I was simply a piece of broken furniture, waiting to be moved to a permanent care facility. She stopped hovering over me when I watched television in the living room. She stopped lowering her voice when I wandered into the kitchen. Most importantly, she became incredibly dangerously careless. She began taking phone calls out on the back patio, with the sliding glass doors wide open. I would sit in my armchair, pretending to be asleep, with the television volume turned up, while I listened to her complain to her mysterious lawyer about the slow processing times of the conservatorship paperwork. She spoke with absolute impunity, entirely confident that the drooling old man in the next room could not comprehend a single syllable. Her arrogance extended to her physical possessions as well. The cheap prepaid burner phone she used for her secret communications was no longer hidden away in her designer purse. She started leaving it casually resting on the kitchen island while she took her long, luxurious showers upstairs, assuming I was too confused to even recognize what the small black plastic device was. I knew I needed to access the contents of that phone, but I could not do it alone. I began establishing a harmless daily routine to get myself out of the house. I told Derek that the doctor recommended light exercise for my joint pain. Every afternoon I would slowly shuffle out the front door and make my way down the street toward the quiet neighborhood park. I made sure my gait was terribly slow and unbalanced, knowing Natalie was likely watching me from the second-story window. On my third consecutive trip to the park, I sat heavily on a green wooden bench near the duck pond. 10 minutes later, Gary casually strolled down the paved walking path and sat down right next to me. He did not look at me directly. He held a newspaper open in front of his face. He reached into his deep coat pocket and smoothly slid a small rectangular metallic device onto the wooden slats between us. It was no larger than a standard deck of playing cards. "It is a dual band SIM cloner," Gary muttered quietly. "It is completely pre-configured. You just need to slide her SIM card into the primary slot for exactly 60 seconds. It will copy the decryption keys and the entire message history directly onto the internal storage. Get it done and bring the device back to me." I slipped the cold metal block into my pocket, gave Gary a silent nod, and began my long shuffling walk back to the mansion. The opportunity presented itself the very next morning. Natalie was upstairs, running the vacuum in the guest bedrooms. Her black burner phone was sitting unprotected right next to the coffee maker. My hands moved with a speed and precision that completely betrayed my 70 years. I popped the plastic back off her phone, removed the tiny square card, and slid it into Gary's cloning device. The small green light blinked rapidly. 58, 59, 60. The light turned solid blue. I shoved the card back into her phone, snapped the cover in place, and retreated to the living room couch, just seconds before she came walking down the stairs. That afternoon, I returned to the park and handed the metallic block back to Gary. I thought we were just going to uncover the full extent of her financial theft. I thought I expected to simply find banking routing numbers to reclaim my funds. Instead, Gary plugged it into his laptop and froze his face pale. Gary slammed the laptop shut before the screen even fully loaded. He looked around the sunny park with sudden, intense paranoia, his eyes darting toward every passing jogger and casual dog walker. He whispered that we could not do this out in the open, not with what the initial decryption sequence was suddenly flagging on his system. He told me to meet him at a secure location in exactly 1 hour. I nodded, keeping my expression perfectly blank as I slowly shuffled away from the duck pond. I did not return to the sprawling mansion. Instead, I walked 3 blocks down to a busy commercial intersection just outside the quiet neighborhood limits. I flagged down a passing rideshare vehicle, carefully pulling a crisp $100 bill from the bottom of my left shoe. I had been hiding emergency cash in my footwear for several weeks, fully anticipating the inevitable day my personal credit cards would be mysteriously declined or completely canceled by my increasingly brazen daughter-in-law. I handed the confused driver the cash and gave him a specific address on the opposite side of Austin, instructing him to take the fastest possible route to avoid any potential surveillance. The drive took 40 tense minutes, placing me directly in front of a sleek, unassuming glass building that safely housed the private offices of Sarah Jenkins. The unmarked building was located in a heavily wooded, extremely discreet business park that specifically catered to high-profile corporate clients demanding absolute privacy and total anonymity from the incredibly intrusive public eye. Sarah was my original estate lawyer, a ruthless, uncompromised bulldog of an attorney who had expertly helped me navigate my most hostile corporate takeovers decades ago. She was the one loyal person Natalie had not yet managed to completely isolate me from, simply because Natalie did not know Sarah existed outside of my heavily archived corporate filing cabinets. I walked through the heavy sliding glass doors and took the private elevator directly to her secure top floor. The quiet reception area was completely empty, intentionally cleared out for our highly sensitive, absolutely confidential afternoon meeting. Gary was already waiting nervously in the soundproof conference room when I finally arrived. Sarah sat confidently at the head of the heavy glass table, her sharp eyes carefully scanning the frantic, disjointed notes Gary had already provided her. I sat down in the leather chair and quickly outlined the terrifying reality of my current situation. I explicitly explained the forced chemical sedation, the forged financial signatures, the deliberately isolated banking accounts, and the pending legal conservatorship Natalie was aggressively pursuing to completely strip me of my basic human rights and total financial autonomy. Sarah did not waste a single second offering any useless sympathy or hollow comfort. She immediately went to work with a terrifying calculated efficiency that reminded me exactly why I had hired her so many years ago. She began frantically drafting the complex legal framework necessary to quickly establish an impenetrable blind trust. We needed to quietly and swiftly move the bulk of my remaining $15 million in liquid assets completely out of Natalie's reach before the conservatorship could be formally finalized in a corrupt court of law. Sarah calmly explained that she was actively constructing a massive corporate firewall, legally transferring my remaining wealth into secure independent trust accounts that absolutely required multiple layers of verified physical and biometric authorization to access. She worked the keyboard with practiced speed, routing the capital through a highly complex series of protected holding companies designed to confuse even the most skilled forensic accountants. She assured me that even if Natalie successfully forged my signature on every single domestic financial document she could find, she would hit a solid brick wall the exact moment she tried to access the newly protected trust. The money would be effectively frozen and entirely shielded from any fast-tracked domestic conservatorship order Natalie might manage to illegally procure. Natalie was going to confidently reach into the proverbial cookie jar and find it completely, permanently empty. The thought brought a small, grim smile to my face, my first real smile in weeks. While Sarah meticulously processed the rapid asset transfers, she picked up her secure office phone and placed a direct, heavily encrypted call to a former federal private investigator she kept on a permanent, high-level retainer. She gave the seasoned investigator the exact name of the prominent Austin law firm I had seen printed on the delivery envelope earlier that week. She ordered a comprehensive, highly discreet background check on the specific lawyer actively handling the conservatorship paperwork for Natalie. Sarah strongly suspected that Natalie could not possibly pull off a legal maneuver of this massive complex magnitude without a highly placed inside contact, who was perfectly willing to intentionally bend the rules for a significant cut of the stolen fortune. We needed to know exactly who we were fighting in the corrupt courtroom before the legal battle officially began. The investigator promised to have a complete, detailed dossier on the lawyer, personal finances, and hidden political connections within exactly 48 hours. The room fell into a heavy, highly tense silence as the steady, rhythmic clicking of Gary's computer mouse softly echoed off the thick glass walls. As Sarah officially finalized the protective legal documents and successfully confirmed the enormous wire transfers, Gary finally finished fully processing the massive data extraction from the cloned SIM card I had provided. The small green progress bar on his encrypted laptop screen hit exactly 100%. He immediately began rapidly scrolling through thousands of intercepted text messages, hidden audio files, and secure, heavily encrypted email chains. I sat directly across from him and watched his face closely, anxiously, waiting for him to uncover the specific banking routing numbers and the hidden offshore accounts Natalie was undoubtedly using to stash my stolen millions. I desperately wanted to see the undeniable proof of her financial theft fully laid bare on the glowing monitor. Instead, his rapid scrolling slowly came to a complete dead stop. He opened a specific password-protected file directory that was simply labeled with Derek initials. The healthy color rapidly drained from Gary's face, leaving his skin looking completely ashen and deeply sickened. He let out a sharp, ragged breath that sounded incredibly loud in the quiet room. He slowly closed the laptop screen halfway down, as if he were physically trying to hide the disturbing digital contents from his own eyes. His hands were visibly shaking over the plastic keyboard. He looked up at me, his voice trembling with a genuine, profound terror I had never once heard from him in all the decades we had known each other. The atmosphere in the secure room instantly shifted from calculated legal defense to absolute chilling dread. "Richard," he whispered, his eyes wide and filled with a dark, terrible realization. "She is not just stealing your money. You need to look at what she is doing to Derek." My blood ran entirely cold as I slowly leaned forward to stare at the illuminated computer monitor, preparing my rapidly racing mind for the absolute worst possible digital revelation. I leaned closer to the glowing screen of Gary's laptop, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I could not believe what I was reading. The betrayal was absolute. It was pure evil. The digital folders were filled with hundreds of intercepted text messages between Natalie and a private, unlicensed pharmacist across the Mexican border. She was not discussing financial transfers or forged legal documents. She was meticulously detailing the specific dosages required to override a grown man's central nervous system without triggering a fatal respiratory collapse. I read the cold clinical descriptions of my son's deteriorating physical state typed out by his wife with the detached precision of a scientist observing a lab rat. She complained about his occasional moments of clarity and demanded stronger synthetic compounds to keep him fully compliant. Gary reached into his worn leather satchel and pulled out a thick sealed manila envelope. He slid it slowly across the glass table toward me, his hands trembling slightly. "I took the thermos you gave me during our last meeting in the park," Gary said, his voice barely a whisper. "I sent the green liquid to a highly discreet independent toxicology lab operating outside the state registry. I told them to run a comprehensive chemical analysis. The results just came back this morning." I opened the envelope and pulled out the laboratory report. The medical terminology was dense, but the bold red warning flags printed next to the chemical breakdowns required no medical degree to understand. I felt sick to my stomach. My hands gripped the paper tightly. I could barely breathe. The truth was undeniable. Natalie daily health smoothies were liquid death. The lab had identified massive unprescribed levels of benzodiazepines, powerful synthetic sedatives typically used in psychiatric wards to subdue violent, uncontrollable patients. But she had not stopped there. The report detailed a secondary, more insidious chemical compound mixed into the thick green fluid. It was an aggressive experimental cognitive disruptor, a synthetic drug specifically designed to impair short-term memory, retention, induce profound mental confusion, and shatter a person's natural executive functioning. I stared at the black letters on the white page, feeling a cold, sickening wave of absolute horror wash over me. She was intentionally poisoning us every morning. She was methodically, chemically lobotomizing both her husband and her father-in-law right at the breakfast table. The daily dosage was meticulously calculated to keep us functioning just enough to physically walk talk in basic sentences and sign our names on legally binding financial documents. It was a chemical prison designed to keep us trapped in a perpetual state of agreeable, exhausted compliance. The dense fog that had clouded my mind recently made terrifying sense. The lethargy, the forgotten conversations, the heavy, unnatural sleep that provided no rest. It had never been the natural decline of old age. It was the deliberate introduction of heavy neurotoxins into my bloodstream. I looked back at the horrific text messages illuminated on Gary's computer screen. I thought about Derek sitting at the large kitchen island that morning. His skin pale and waxy, his shoulders slumped in defeat, blindly signing away his future. A profound, shattering realization struck me with the force of a physical blow. My son was not a willing accomplice in this scheme. He was not plotting to steal my fortune or drain my life savings to fund a lavish lifestyle. He was a hostage trapped in the depths of his chemically altered mind. The perceived betrayal that had been eating away at my soul was entirely fabricated by the woman who swore to love and protect him. Derek had never turned against me. He had simply been erased. The guilt of doubting him hit me hard. He needed me now more than ever. I had to save him. I slowly set the laboratory report down on the glass table and took a long, deep breath to steady my shaking hands. The raw, burning anger that had consumed me rapidly evolved into something more dangerous. It transformed into a cold, sharpened blade of paternal resolve. My mission to protect my financial assets and secure my logistics legacy became irrelevant. The millions of dollars locked behind Sarah's corporate firewall meant nothing if my son lost his life to an overdose of neurotoxins. Natalie had made a miscalculation. She assumed that by neutralizing my mind, she had removed the obstacle standing between her and a massive fortune. She did not realize she had just awakened a protective father who would burn the world to the ground to save his boy. I would not let her win this. I would break her entirely. This was war. She would pay for everything. I looked at Sarah, who was watching me with a determined expression, and then at Gary, who still looked shaken by the magnitude of the evil we had just uncovered. "We are changing our operational strategy," I told them, my voice hard and devoid of any fear. "The financial defense remains in place, but my objective is now a rescue mission. We are getting my son out of that house alive." Sarah nodded silently, quickly pulling up a fresh encrypted document on her laptop. "We can immediately file an emergency injunction with the state police," she suggested. "We can bring these verified toxicology reports to a judge, have Natalie arrested for attempted murder and elder abuse, and finally get Derek safely transported to a secure medical facility by this evening." I closed my tired eyes and slowly shook my head. The raw temptation to call the authorities and watch the police drag Natalie out of that mansion in handcuffs was overwhelming. But the clinical details in the toxicology report dictated a more complicated and dangerous reality. I pointed a finger at the dense chemical breakdown printed on the paperwork. "We cannot stop the medication," I explained, my voice tight with a rising dread. "Look at the nature of these synthetic compounds. The dosage of heavy sedatives she has been pumping into his system for months has altered his neurochemistry. If we kick the glass out of his hand tomorrow morning and cut off the supply, his central nervous system will collapse. Sudden withdrawal from this level of chemical dependency will trigger neurological shocks. He will suffer seizures, organ failure, and he could slip into a coma before the paramedics pull their ambulance into the driveway." Natalie knew exactly what she was doing when she selected these drugs. She had created a biological hostage situation. If she went down, Derek would go down with her. The authorities would secure the crime scene, but they could not save his brain from the chemical shock. I stared at the glass table as the weight of the problem settled onto my shoulders. I could not rely on the police to kick down the front doors. I had to return to that mansion and continue playing the clueless old fool. I had to sit across from the monster who was poisoning my family smile at her and figure out a way to methodically detox my son right under her eyes, without letting her see a symptom of his withdrawal. I knew that sudden, complete withdrawal from the heavy synthetic sedatives could easily kill my son. I had to slowly taper him off the neurotoxins, while simultaneously pretending the chemical fog was still pulling me under. I spent the next afternoon at a local organic grocery store, meticulously searching the cold aisles until I found a heavily processed, dark green kale and spinach juice that perfectly matched the exact color and thick consistency of Natalie toxic morning smoothies. I bought a dozen large bottles and smuggled them back into the mansion, hiding them securely behind a row of old paint cans in the dark, climate-controlled basement garage where she never ventured. The very next morning, the high-stakes deception officially began. I shuffled into the bright kitchen wearing my thick robe, my hands shaking with a carefully practiced tremor. Natalie was already running the blender, the loud mechanical whir masking the sound of my footsteps. When she turned around to grab her expensive ceramic coffee mug from the espresso machine, I made my move. Decades ago, long before I built my logistics empire, I used to play high-stakes poker with incredibly ruthless union bosses in dimly lit back rooms. I knew exactly how to misdirect attention and move my hands with blinding, invisible speed. I swiftly grabbed my glass, and Derek glass smoothly pouring the poisoned sludge down the secondary sink drain. In one fluid motion, I pulled the hidden flask of clean store-bought juice from the deep pocket of my robe and refilled both tumblers just seconds before Natalie turned back around. She smiled sweetly, completely oblivious to the fact that she had just served us harmless vegetables instead of her synthetic lobotomy cocktail. I smiled back, playing the vacant, docile old man to absolute perfection. I successfully executed the invisible swap for 3 consecutive mornings. I systematically reduced the trace amounts of her poison I allowed to remain in Derek glass, slowly stepping down his chemical dependency to prevent a catastrophic shock to his fragile central nervous system. By the fourth day, the severe physical reality of the detox process violently took hold of my son. We were sitting in the grand living room after breakfast. Derek was slouched deeply into the leather sofa, his face buried in his hands. A thick layer of cold sweat beaded on his pale forehead. He was shivering slightly, despite the warm morning sunlight streaming through the massive bay windows. He let out a low, ragged groan, pressing his fingers hard against his temples. He complained of a blinding, crushing migraine that felt like a jagged spike being driven directly behind his eyes. His hands trembled as he desperately tried to steady his shallow breathing. The chemical hooks were being violently ripped from his brain, and the painful withdrawal was absolute agony. Natalie rushed into the living room, her sharp heels clicking against the hardwood floor. She carried a small silver tray holding a tall glass of iced water and a small, delicate porcelain bowl filled with several large white pills. "Oh, Derek, my poor sweetheart," she cooed, her voice dripping with artificial saccharine sympathy. "Your stress levels are just far too high with all this new corporate restructuring. You need to take these special herbal supplements. Dr. Aris specifically prescribed them to help manage your sudden tension headaches. They will make you feel so much better, I promise." I stared at the white pills. I knew exactly what they were. They were a concentrated dose of heavy sedatives. If he swallowed them, he would be instantly plunged right back into the suffocating chemical prison she had built for him. All of my dangerous, methodical detox work would be completely destroyed in a matter of seconds. I could not let her hand him that porcelain bowl. I weaponized my manufactured dementia. As Natalie leaned over the sofa to press the pills into Derek, shaking hands, I let out a distressed gasp. I violently knocked my knees against the heavy glass coffee table, causing the expensive decorative vases to rattle loudly. I stumbled forward, my arms flailing wildly in the air, and threw myself directly between Natalie and my son. "Martha!" I shouted, my voice cracking with perfectly simulated, absolute panic. "Martha, where is the yellow file? The bank needs the yellow file before the freight trucks leave the loading dock. The drivers are waiting for me in the rain." I aggressively grabbed Natalie by her slender forearms, completely blocking her physical access to Derek. I pulled her backward, forcing her to step away from the sofa to maintain her balance. The silver tray wobbled dangerously in her hands. The tall glass of iced water tipped over, spilling a cold wave of liquid directly onto her expensive silk blouse. The small porcelain bowl slid across the wet metal and crashed onto the floor, scattering the dangerous white pills across the thick Persian rug. Natalie let out a sharp, furious hiss, her eyes flashing with a sudden, unrestrained hatred. "Richard, stop it!" She snapped, her carefully maintained facade of the loving daughter-in-law violently cracking under the sudden frustration. "Sit down immediately. You are confused." I ignored her command and clung to her sleeves tighter, amplifying my performance. I began to actively weep, forcing large wet tears to roll down my wrinkled cheeks. "Please, Martha," I begged, my voice trembling with profound, pathetic desperation. "Do not let them take the trucks. I built this company for Derek. You promised me you would find the yellow file." I was a pathetic, clingy physical barrier that she could not simply push aside without dropping her entire charade in front of my son. Derek weakly lifted his head from the sofa, blinking through his severe migraine. "Mom is not here, Dad," he mumbled, his voice thick with exhaustion and confusion. "Just let Natalie clean up the mess." Natalie ripped her arms out of my hands, her chest heaving with explosive rage. She stared down at the ruined pills dissolving in the spilled water on the carpet. She took a deep, shuddering breath, visibly forcing the terrifying monster back inside its cage. She pasted a tight, strained smile onto her lips and gently patted my shoulder. "It is all right, Richard," she said, her voice completely devoid of any real warmth. "The trucks are fine. I will go find your file right now. You just sit here and rest your tired mind." I slumped back into my armchair, letting my chin fall to my chest, as if all the frantic energy had suddenly drained from me. I kept my eyes heavily lidded, watching her every move through a narrow, hidden slit. She turned her back to me and quickly pulled her black burner phone from the tight pocket of her slacks. I could clearly see the bright reflection of the glowing screen in the polished glass of the large bay window directly in front of her. The mirrored text was slightly distorted, but my sharp vision caught the exact terrifying words she aggressively typed. She sent a text to her lawyer. "The old man is becoming a physical nuisance. Moving the signing to this Friday." The terrifying text message on Natalie's phone confirmed that my window of opportunity was rapidly slamming shut. She was moving the final conservatorship signing to this coming Friday. I had less than 48 hours to gather the physical, irrefutable proof of her financial crimes before a corrupt judge completely erased my legal existence. The detox operation was proceeding flawlessly, but Derek was still physically weak and mentally recovering from the severe chemical withdrawal. I had to secure the paper trail myself. My chance arrived the following afternoon. Natalie casually announced she was heading out for a lavish 3-hour spa appointment to manage her mounting stress. The moment her expensive luxury SUV disappeared down the long paved driveway, I abandoned my hunched posture and moved with urgent, deliberate speed. I walked directly to the heavy oak door of Derek's home office. Natalie had started locking it during the day, confident that a senile old man would simply rattle the brass handle and eventually wander away. But she severely underestimated a man who had spent his youth picking cheap padlocks at commercial freight yards. I retrieved a pair of thin tension wrenches from my pocket, slipped them into the keyhole, and expertly popped the tumblers in under 60 seconds. I stepped inside the quiet, dimly lit room and quickly closed the heavy door behind me. The air felt stale, smelling faintly of old paper and stale coffee. I moved straight toward the massive mahogany desk. The surface was cluttered with thick manila folders, precisely the kind she had been sliding in front of my heavily drugged son every single morning. I pulled my hidden secondary smartphone from my jacket pocket and prepared the high-resolution camera. I began sifting through the massive stacks of paperwork. My heart hammered against my ribs as the sheer staggering magnitude of her criminal operation was finally laid bare before my eyes. There were dozens of comprehensive bank statements, commercial real estate transfers, and highly complex incorporation documents for offshore shell companies I had never once authorized. She was systematically dismantling my massive logistics empire and funneling the liquid assets into untraceable corporate entities completely under her exclusive control. The printed text on the complex financial ledgers was incredibly small, intentionally formatted to be difficult to decipher. I reached into the top drawer of the desk and pulled out a heavy brass-rimmed magnifying glass Derek used for reading tiny legal print. I held the magnifying glass perfectly steady over the physical documents, hovering the smartphone camera just above the curved lens to capture crisp, magnified images of the most damning evidence. I meticulously photographed the routing numbers, the forged executive signatures, and the clear, undeniable paper trail that linked her newly formed shell companies directly to my violently depleted personal accounts. I was so intensely focused on securing the sharpest possible digital images that I completely tuned out the ambient noise of the massive house. I was capturing the final page of a massive unauthorized wire transfer when the heavy silence of the estate was abruptly shattered. The heavy, distinctive thud of the front double doors violently slamming shut echoed through the wide, cavernous hallway. My blood instantly ran entirely cold. Natalie was back. She had returned nearly 2 hours earlier than she had originally announced. Heavy, fast footsteps clicked rapidly against the polished hardwood floors, moving with sharp, aggressive purpose directly toward the main office. There was absolutely no time to hide the massive stack of scattered financial documents. There was no alternate exit. I was completely trapped. I quickly shoved my smartphone deep into my inner jacket pocket, frantically praying I had remembered to silence the digital camera shutter. The brass doorknob aggressively turned. The heavy oak door swung open, and Natalie stopped dead in her tracks in the threshold. The air in the room instantly evaporated, replaced by a dense, suffocating tension that felt physically crushing. She stared at me, her dark eyes dropping immediately to the highly sensitive bank statements currently clutched in my trembling hands, and then to the brass magnifying glass resting on top of the mahogany desk. For a split second, the horrifying truth hovered in the tense air between us. She saw a man actively investigating her deeply hidden crimes. I saw the absolute, terrifying realization flash across her sharp features. If I allowed her to process this moment logically, she would destroy every single piece of paper in this room and immediately call her corrupt lawyers to forcibly remove me from the premises. I had to pivot, and I had to do it flawlessly. I weaponized my carefully cultivated dementia with an Oscar-worthy desperation. Before she could open her mouth to demand a rational explanation or hurl a vicious accusation, I let the thick stack of financial documents slip completely from my loose grasp. The papers fluttered to the carpeted floor like dead leaves. I widened my eyes, filling them with a raw, unadulterated terror that bordered on absolute unhinged hysteria. I let my jaw go slack and began to breathe in shallow, frantic gasps. I looked right through her, staring blankly at the empty hallway behind her shoulders. "Martha." I cried out, my voice cracking with a pathetic, agonizing panic. "Martha, where is the bus schedule?" I frantically patted my empty pockets, spinning around in a tight, confused circle. "I need the bus schedule right now. The morning shift is going to completely stall. The foremen are waiting for me at the downtown warehouse, and the freight trucks cannot leave without my dispatch codes." I intentionally let my knees buckle slightly, grabbing the edge of the mahogany desk for physical support. I began to openly weep, forcing hot, wet tears to rapidly spill down my wrinkled cheeks. "Please, Martha, you have to help me find the yellow bus pass. They are going to fire me if I miss the morning bell." I fully committed to the tragic illusion, projecting the deeply broken mind of a man completely trapped 30 long years in the past. Natalie's rigid posture slowly relaxed. The terrifying suspicion that had momentarily hardened her sharp features instantly melted away, rapidly, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated disgust. She sneered, her top lip curling upward in profound revulsion at the pathetic weeping shell of a man standing before her. She stepped into the office, aggressively snatched the scattered financial documents from the carpeted floor, and shoved them carelessly into the desk drawer. She grabbed my arm with a painful, bruising grip and forcefully pushed me toward the hallway. "Go back to your bedroom, you crazy old fool," she spat, her voice dripping with venomous contempt. "There are no freight trucks. Just go watch your television." She violently slammed the heavy oak door shut behind me, the loud click of the brass lock echoing sharply in the quiet corridor. I kept my shoulders heavily slumped and maintained a slow, shuffling gait as I walked away. But the moment I reached the protective shadows of the grand staircase, my fake tears instantly vanished. My trembling hands became perfectly steady. A cold, victorious smirk slowly spread across my face. I had the photos. I retreated to my designated bedroom, deliberately maintaining my incredibly slow, shuffling gait until the heavy mahogany door was securely locked behind me. Once completely isolated from her watchful eyes, I pulled the hidden smartphone from my dark jacket pocket. My hands moved with urgent, calculating precision as I rapidly connected to the highly encrypted virtual private network that Gary had carefully set up for me. I quickly uploaded the high-resolution images of the forged banking statements, the entirely unauthorized commercial real estate transfers, and the incredibly complex offshore incorporation documents. I sent the encrypted package directly to Sarah and Gary, ensuring the physical proof of Natalie's financial crimes was safely stored on a secure server located far beyond the stone walls of this mansion. I deleted the local files and destroyed the digital breadcrumbs. Now all I could do was wait. I sat in the dark, staring at the ceiling, replaying the terrifying moment in the office. I had narrowly escaped a catastrophic confrontation. If my performance had faltered for even a fraction of a second, my son and I would be entirely at her mercy. The absolute silence of the room was finally broken by a sharp, vibrating buzz from the secure phone resting on my mattress. I immediately answered. It was Sarah. Her voice was uncharacteristically tight, stripped of its usual calm confidence. "Richard," she began, her tone carrying a heavy, ominous weight. "I received the digital files you transmitted. Gary is currently running the routing numbers through our forensic accounting software to trace the offshore shell companies, but that is not why I am calling you on the encrypted line right now. The private investigator just returned with the comprehensive background dossier on Natalie. You need to sit down and listen to me very carefully, because the situation is far worse than a simple, greedy daughter-in-law trying to accelerate her inheritance." I braced myself, gripping the edge of the mattress. I told her I was listening. Sarah took a deep breath over the secure connection. She explained that the private investigator had dug extensively into Natalie, past bypassing the polished public records social media profiles and meticulously cultivated socialite image. The investigator had utilized highly classified contacts to pull heavily restricted financial histories and sealed court documents. The woman currently living in my house was a complete fabrication. Her entire constructed persona was an elaborate lie designed to infiltrate our family. Sarah started the devastating debriefing by focusing on the business. For the past 3 years, Derek had been incredibly proud of Natalie's flourishing entrepreneurial career. He had proudly provided the massive initial seed money to help her launch what she claimed was a highly exclusive, elite event planning company catering exclusively to wealthy corporate clients and high-net-worth individuals in the greater Austin area. She rented an expensive downtown office suite, hired a professional website designer, and frequently complained about her incredibly demanding clientele. "Richard," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a harsh, cold whisper. The private investigator pulled her corporate tax filings and audited her supposedly robust vendor contracts. Her high-end event planning company has absolutely zero actual clients. It has never hosted a single legitimate corporate event or private gala. There are no caterers, no floral invoices, no venue deposits, and no employee payroll. The entire company is a hollow ghost ship, a sophisticated phantom front specifically designed to silently siphon money directly out of Derek's personal checking and investment accounts. She has been systematically invoicing his private wealth management firm for exorbitant, entirely fictional event services, effectively laundering his clean capital through her fake business and moving it seamlessly into untraceable offshore accounts. The downtown office she claimed to visit every day has been completely empty for 2 years. I felt a sickening wave of revulsion wash over me. My son had unknowingly funded the instrument of his own financial destruction, blindly trusting a ruthless woman who viewed him as nothing more than a profitable mark. But the massive financial fraud was merely the beginning of this endlessly terrifying nightmare. I urgently asked Sarah about the prominent, highly respected Austin law firm boldly printed on the return address of the heavy conservatorship delivery envelope I had intercepted. I demanded to know about the specific shadowy legal counsel Natalie was aggressively texting from her secret black plastic burner phone. The quiet, distinct rustle of heavy legal paper faintly echoed over the secure, encrypted line as Sarah rapidly flipped through the investigator's highly detailed, comprehensive dossier. The man she has been constantly secretly communicating with is absolutely not a legitimate conservatorship specialist, Sarah revealed, her sharp tone laced with absolute, chilling professional disgust. He does not work for that prominent downtown law firm. He rented a tiny virtual mailbox in their main lobby to intercept official legal correspondence and illegally use their prestigious corporate address to create an intimidating illusion of ultimate legal authority. His real name is Julian Vance. He is a permanently disbarred attorney who was completely stripped of his legal license 7 years ago after being federally investigated for orchestrating massive, highly complex wire fraud schemes across 3 different states. And Richard, he is not just her corrupt, shadowy legal counsel. The private investigator managed to successfully access highly secured hotel surveillance footage and heavily concealed personal travel logs. Julian Vance is her longtime, deeply entrenched romantic lover. They have been secretly involved for nearly a decade, coordinating their movements long before she ever strategically bumped into your son at that charity gala. They target vulnerable wealthy men, separate them from their protective families, and drain them dry. I slowly closed my eyes, desperately trying to absorb the sickening, overwhelming reality. The heavily toxic green smoothies, the countless forged financial documents, the completely isolated, heavily monitored mansion. It was all a perfectly choreographed, highly rehearsed, and exceptionally cruel criminal operation seamlessly run by two incredibly ruthless predators. I told Sarah that we urgently needed to freeze the remaining bank accounts and physically extract Derek from the dangerous house before they could legally finalize the fraudulent conservatorship this coming Friday morning. I told her we finally had enough solid, irrefutable evidence to permanently put them both behind federal bars for the rest of their miserable, pathetic lives. There was a painfully long pause on the other end of the secure line. The dead silence stretched so heavily that I honestly thought the unstable, encrypted connection had unexpectedly dropped. When Sarah finally spoke again, her voice was barely above a shaking whisper, carrying a profound, chilling dread that made my blood run entirely cold. "Richard, you do not understand the full scope of their exit strategy," she said slowly. "Gary just finished cross-referencing the forged signature authorizations you sent over with the offshore account routing numbers Julian established. They know the federal authorities will eventually flag the missing millions. They have carefully structured every single illegal wire transfer, every fraudulent corporate invoice, and every offshore shell company directly under Derek primary executive credentials." She paused, letting the horrifying reality settle in the cold room. "Richard, they are not just taking your money. They are framing Derek." The suffocating silence in the secure conference room felt entirely unbearable. I stared at the encrypted phone resting on the heavy glass table, trying to process the absolute devastation in Sarah Jenkins' voice. Gary was already pulling up the offshore financial records on his laptop, his fingers flying across the plastic keyboard with desperate, frantic speed. We needed to piece together the entire money trail before the corrupt legal machinery completely finalized my total destruction. Gary brought up a complex visual map of the digital transactions on the glowing monitor. He pointed to a series of massive, staggered deposits flowing steadily out of Natalie Fake Event Planning Company. The stolen money was not sitting stagnant in her fraudulent corporate accounts. It was moving, but it was not moving into the offshore shell companies directly under her name or Julian Vance's name. The capital was being systematically routed right back into the country, meticulously laundered, and directly deposited into Derek personal high-yield investment portfolios. I leaned closer to the bright screen, my heart pounding, a heavy, painful rhythm against my ribs. I watched the digital lines connecting the fraudulent phantom business directly to my son's private wealth management accounts. Natalie and Julian were actively running a highly sophisticated multi-million-dollar money laundering syndicate, cleaning dirty capital from Julian. Illegal wire fraud operations through the fake event planning front. And they were using my heavily drugged, chemically lobotomized son as the ultimate unsuspecting clearinghouse. Every single morning while Derek sat at the kitchen island, trapped in a thick, synthetic fog, she was sliding those complex investment transfer authorizations across the marble countertop. He had been blindly signing his legal name to hundreds of fraudulent financial documents, completely unaware that he was officially authorizing the illegal movement of massive sums of heavily laundered cash. She was treating him with heavy, dangerous neurotoxins specifically to secure his unthinking, docile compliance. The sheer calculating evil of her daily routine was absolutely breathtaking. She poured him a glass of poison, kissed his pale cheek, and then calmly handed him a pen to sign away his entire life. Sarah continued explaining the terrifying reality over the secure speakerphone. Her tone was sharp, analytical, and completely devoid of any false comfort. She outlined the catastrophic legal trap Natalie had meticulously constructed around my son. If the Internal Revenue Service or the Federal Bureau of Investigation ever launched an audit into the suspicious financial transfers, the entire paper trail would lead directly and exclusively to Derek. Natalie's name was legally insulated from the final destination accounts. Julian Vance was a disbarred ghost operating entirely in the shadows. Derek's legal signature was on every single piece of damning financial evidence. If the federal authorities raided the mansion and seized the hard drives, my son would be completely unable to defend himself. He would sound deeply confused, mentally compromised, and highly unreliable on a witness stand. The federal prosecutors would look at the massive influx of illegal capital in his personal investment accounts and the signed authorizations in his home office. They would charge him as the sole mastermind of a massive, highly illegal financial syndicate. My son would take the sole devastating fall for the entire multi-million-dollar operation. He would face a minimum of 20 years in a federal penitentiary. The room spun slightly as the true, horrifying motive behind this elaborate nightmare finally crystallized in my mind. The money was only one part of the equation. Natalie wanted absolute, unquestioned freedom, and she wanted it without a single trace of legal or social consequence. I sat back in the leather chair, staring blankly at the glass wall of the conference room. I finally understood the dark, brilliant perfection of her exit strategy. With Derek permanently locked away in a federal prison cell, totally discredited and legally destroyed, she would assume the incredibly sympathetic role of the deeply shocked, aggrieved wife. She would publicly weep, claiming she had absolutely no idea her husband was a secret, high-level criminal. Society would pity her. Her wealthy socialite friends would fiercely rally around her. And with me, the only other potential obstacle, securely locked away in a permanent dementia care facility under a legally binding medical conservatorship, there would be absolutely no one left to challenge her. She would be granted total, immediate, and completely uncontested control over the entirety of our combined corporate logistics estate and personal wealth. She would quietly liquidate the massive assets funneling the clean, legitimate millions into untraceable offshore trusts. Once the dust settled and the public eventually forgot about the tragic downfall of our prestigious family, she would simply file for divorce. She would sever all legal ties to her incarcerated husband, pack her expensive designer bags, and quietly disappear across international borders to join Julian Vance. They would live out the rest of their pathetic lives in absolute luxury, entirely funded by my lifetime of hard work and my son's complete destruction. It was a flawless, cold-blooded execution of a modern financial assassination. A powerful, overwhelming surge of protective rage ignited deep within my chest, burning away the remaining shock and fear. The woman sleeping in my house, pretending to be a loving wife and a concerned daughter-in-law, was a venomous predator actively planning to slaughter my family for a massive payout. I would not allow it. I would not let her destroy my boy. I looked at Gary, who was staring at the screen with wide, terrified eyes, and then spoke directly into the secure phone to Sarah. "We are not just defending my money anymore," I said, my voice hardening into cold, unforgiving steel. "We are going to completely dismantle their entire operation, and we are going to bury Natalie and Julian under the weight of their own criminal evidence. I need every single piece of documentation proving the systematic money laundering. We need to build an airtight case for the federal authorities before they can ever finalize this trap." Sarah completely agreed instantly, promising to have her elite investigative team work straight through the night to compile the definitive, undeniable legal counterstrike against their operation. I ended the encrypted call and slowly stood up, feeling a dangerous, incredibly heavy resolve firmly settle into my aging bones. I had to quickly return to the sprawling, isolated mansion. I had to continue flawlessly playing the broken, hopelessly senile old man. I had to watch the ruthless poisoner warmly smile at me over the bright breakfast table, knowing exactly what she was secretly planning to do to both of us. And I had to expertly execute the slow, agonizing detox operations to save Derek's totally shattered mind without ever raising a single solitary trace of suspicion. The invisible clock was aggressively ticking with a terrifying, absolute finality. I looked out the large glass window at the rapidly darkening Austin skyline, watching the deep, heavy shadows stretching long across the quiet, wooded business park. The bright sun was rapidly setting on our fragile temporary safety. Tomorrow is Friday. It is the exact day Natalie plans to successfully execute the final medical conservatorship and the ultimate power of attorney documents. Over the course of the incredibly tense next 2 days, I continued my dangerous performance, maintaining the pathetic illusion of a fully broken man while methodically executing the highly classified secret detox operation. Every morning, I flawlessly swapped those toxic green smoothies for the harmless vegetable juice I had hidden in the garage. Every afternoon, I physically intercepted Natalie whenever she attempted to press those heavy synthetic sedatives into my son, shaking hands. I played the incredibly clingy, completely terrified dementia patient to absolute perfection, creating chaotic, noisy distractions that prevented her from administering the chemical lobotomy. By the 5th day, a profound shift occurred. The severe withdrawal symptoms racking Derek's body finally began to subside. The heavy, unnatural sweating stopped. The blinding, crushing migraines slowly faded into a dull, manageable ache. But the most incredible transformation was in his eyes. The vacant stare that haunted me for months was gone. At the breakfast table that Thursday morning, Derek looked around the massive kitchen with a sudden, sharp clarity. He sat up straight, his posture returning to the confident executive he used to be. He looked at Natalie, and a flicker of genuine suspicion crossed his face when she placed the smoothie in front of him. I kicked his shin gently under the table, catching his eye to give him a warning shake of my head. He blinked, confused by my sudden lucidity, but followed my lead and pushed the glass away, claiming his stomach was unsettled. Natalie frowned, but simply retreated to the patio to make another secret phone call. The thick, suffocating chemical fog had finally lifted. My son was finally back. Now I had to completely shatter his heart to save his life. I waited until the dead of night, long after Natalie retreated to the master suite, and the mansion fell into heavy silence. I silently crept down the dark hallway and gently knocked on the door of the guest room where Derek had been sleeping. When he opened the door, he looked exhausted but entirely present. I placed a finger over my lips, signaling for silence, and gestured for him to follow me. I led him down the narrow back staircase and into the basement garage. The air smelled faintly of motor oil. I locked the heavy steel door behind us, ensuring we were isolated. I turned on a dusty radio I had kept since my early days at the loading docks. I dialed the volume up, letting the static-filled jazz broadcast muffle our voices and block any hidden listening devices Natalie might have placed around the property. Derek stood in the center of the dimly lit garage, crossing his arms over his chest. He searched my face for the broken old man he had mourned for months. Instead, he found the sharp, uncompromising father who built a logistics empire. "Dad, what is going on?" he asked, his voice steady. "You have been acting out of your mind for weeks, and now you bring me down here in the middle of the night. What is happening to us?" I did not offer any gentle, comforting words to soften the devastating blow. I walked to the workbench and pulled away the heavy canvas tarp concealing my makeshift evidence board. I laid out the physical proof of our absolute destruction under the harsh light of the single overhead bulb. I placed the certified toxicology reports directly in front of him. I laid out the high-resolution photographs I had taken of the forged corporate bank statements and the complex offshore shell company and corporation documents. Finally, I placed the private investigator comprehensive dossier right in the center, displaying the clear surveillance photographs of Natalie romantically embracing her corrupt, disbarred lawyer, Julian Vance. Derek stepped forward, his eyes rapidly scanning the dense, terrifying paperwork. I calmly, methodically explained every single detail of the nightmare we had been living. I walked him through the laboratory results, explaining how the woman he loved had been systematically poisoning his daily smoothies with dangerous, unprescribed levels of heavy sedatives and experimental cognitive disruptors. I showed him the offshore routing numbers and explained how she was using a completely fake phantom event planning company to siphon millions of dollars directly out of our legitimate corporate accounts. I watched his face contort in absolute horror as the undeniable reality of her profound betrayal finally took root in his clearing mind. But the final, most devastating blow came when I pointed to his own legal signatures on the fraudulent transfer authorizations. I explained the catastrophic legal trap she had expertly built around him. I told him that Natalie and Julian were actively running a multi-million-dollar money laundering syndicate, and they had specifically designed the entire operation to leave Derek holding the bag. If the federal authorities ever launched a financial audit, he would be charged as the sole mastermind of the criminal enterprise. He would take the sole fall, facing 20 years in a federal penitentiary, while Natalie assumed the role of the innocent, aggrieved wife and disappeared with his fortune. The realization struck him with the devastating force of a physical blow. Derek's legs completely gave out. He collapsed into a rusted metal folding chair in the corner of the garage, burying his face in his trembling hands. A deep, agonizing sob tore through his chest, echoing loudly over the muffled jazz music playing from the old radio. The absolute realization that the woman he loved had been intentionally poisoning him, destroying his mind, and setting him up to take the fall for a massive federal crime completely shattered his spirit. He wept for the marriage that was a lie, for the trust that had been weaponized, and for the terrifying reality of his narrow escape. I let him cry for exactly 2 minutes. I understood the profound, agonizing grief of a shattered heart, but we simply did not have the luxury of time to mourn a fabricated marriage. Tomorrow was Friday. Tomorrow was the exact day Natalie planned to march into that pristine downtown office and successfully execute the final medical conservatorship and the ultimate power of attorney documents. Tomorrow was the day she planned to legally erase my existence and officially spring the federal trap on my son. I walked across the cold concrete floor and firmly grabbed my son by his shaking shoulders. I pulled his hands away from his tear-stained face and forced him to look me directly in the eyes. I projected every ounce of the ruthless, uncompromising authority I had utilized to conquer the corporate logistics world. "You can cry later," I told him, my voice cold, sharp, and absolute. "Right now you need to be a Stanton. We are not going to sit here and let this venomous predator slaughter our family. We are going to walk into that office tomorrow and burn her world to ashes. Are you with me?" Derek took a very deep, shuddering breath. He slowly wiped the hot tears from his face, his jaw clenching tightly. The profound, overwhelming grief in his eyes instantly vanished completely, replaced by a cold, hardened fury. "I am completely with you now, Dad." The harsh light of Friday morning finally broke across the eastern horizon, casting long, sharp shadows through the plantation shutters of the sprawling mansion. Today was the ultimate culmination of her meticulously orchestrated nightmare. Today she planned to march us into a corrupt legal slaughterhouse and permanently erase our existence. I stood silently in the guest bathroom, with my son, our eyes meeting in the vanity mirror. There was no fear left in his expression, only a cold resolve mirroring my own. We did not exchange a single word. We walked down the staircase together, perfectly tuned to our pathetic roles. I deliberately let my feet drag against the hardwood floors, keeping my shoulders slumped and my chin tucked to my chest. Derek moved with agonizing stiffness, letting his eyes glaze over with a familiar vacant stare. When we entered the sunlit kitchen, Natalie was standing at the marble island. The mechanical whir of the blender filled the room, masking the pounding rhythm of my racing heart. She poured the dark green sludge into our glass tumblers. "Good morning, my sweet boys," she sang, her voice vibrating with an artificial joy. She was glowing, radiating the thrill of a predator cornering its exhausted prey. She slid the glasses across the stone counter. "Drink up. We have an important day ahead of us. We need you healthy." I gave her a wide, foolish smile. I slowly reached for my glass with violently shaking hands. Derek stared blankly at his tumbler, moving his fingers with a sluggish hesitation. Natalie turned her back for exactly 4 seconds to retrieve her burner phone from her designer purse on the table. It was more than enough time. Moving with the blinding speed we had perfected over the past week, I snatched both glasses, dumped the heavy neurotoxins directly down the disposal drain, and instantly refilled them from the hidden flasks tucked inside my robe. When she turned back around, we were both raising the glasses to our lips, swallowing the harmless vegetable juice. "Excellent," she cooed, her dark eyes flashing with terrifying satisfaction. "Go grab your coats. It is time to go." The atmosphere inside her luxurious sport utility vehicle was suffocating with an unspoken tension. Natalie sat behind the steering wheel, driving us toward downtown Austin with a casual confidence. She turned on the surround sound system, filling the climate-controlled cabin with a soothing, smooth jazz broadcast. She was celebrating. In her mind, the war was already over. She had conquered the logistics empire, neutralized the father, and subdued the husband. She was taking her victory lap. "Are we comfortable back there, Richard?" she asked, glancing through the rearview mirror. Her voice was high-pitched, dripping with that condescending baby talk reserved for toddlers or medicated asylum patients. "We are going to a nice office today to sign special papers that will keep you safe and happy. You do not have to worry your tired little head about a single thing ever again. I just need you to write your name nicely for the nice lawyer. Can you do that for me? Can you be a good boy today?" I stared blankly out the tinted passenger window, letting saliva pool at the corner of my slack mouth. I began to hum a tuneless melody, gently rocking my shoulders back and forth against the seat. I did not acknowledge her degrading words, playing the lost dementia patient trapped within his own fractured mind. Beside me, Derek leaned his heavy head against the cool glass. His eyes were half closed, his breathing incredibly shallow. He let his hands rest limply in his lap, perfectly simulating the total mental collapse of a man drowning in synthetic benzodiazepines. He was executing his role flawlessly, completely hiding the burning fury raging through his clearing mind. We navigated through the busy downtown traffic, pulling into the subterranean parking garage of a glass skyscraper that dominated the skyline. Natalie parked the heavy vehicle in a reserved space and hopped out, opening the back doors with a bright, predatory smile. "Let us go, boys," she chirped cheerfully. She reached out and firmly grabbed my elbow, guiding me toward the private elevators with a bruising grip disguised as gentle assistance. Derek stumbled slightly as he exited the vehicle, dragging his feet across the concrete. She wrapped her arm around his waist, practically dragging him forward. We rode the silent, high-speed elevator up to the 40th floor. The polished stainless steel doors opened smoothly, revealing a stunning, opulent reception area decorated in dark mahogany and brushed silver. The quiet room commanded absolute authority and projected an illusion of unquestionable legitimacy. The receptionist did not even ask for our names. She simply stood up, offered a polite nod, and silently pressed a button beneath her desk. A set of frosted glass double doors instantly unlocked with a heavy click. Natalie pushed us forward, marching us directly into the heart of the slaughterhouse. The private conference room was breathtakingly large, featuring expansive windows that offered a panoramic view of the sprawling city. A polished mahogany table dominated the center of the room. Sitting confidently at the far end of the table was Julian Vance. He wore an immaculate, custom-tailored navy blue suit. His dark hair was perfectly styled, and his sharp features were arranged in an expression of deep, compassionate professionalism. But I could see the cold, calculating greed burning fiercely behind his dark eyes. He was the disbarred architect of our destruction, the shadowy lover who orchestrated this nightmare from behind a curtain of fake legal authority. Resting directly in front of him on the wood surface were two dense stacks of legal documents. They were neatly organized, flagged with brightly colored signature stickers, and absolutely lethal. These were the finalized power of attorney transfers and the total medical conservatorship orders. Julian stood up, buttoning his suit jacket with a smooth elegance. He walked around the table, extending a manicured hand toward my acting son. "Welcome, Derek," he said, his voice a soothing baritone. "It is so very good to finally see you looking so relaxed." He turned his predatory gaze toward me, offering a fake smile of profound sympathy. "And Richard, it is a true honor. Please come sit down and rest." We allowed ourselves to be guided into the plush leather chairs directly facing the massive stacks of paper. Natalie stood perfectly still right behind Derek, shoulder resting her manicured hands gently on his back, in a sickening display of loving devotion. Julian returned to his seat, picking up an expensive gold fountain pen. He held it loosely between his fingers, surveying us with the absolute confidence of a man who believed he had won everything. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the smooth mahogany surface. He tapped the gold pen against the thick conservatorship paperwork, the sharp metallic click echoing loudly in the tense room. "Richard Derrick," he began, his voice perfectly smooth and dripping with artificial comfort. "We just need a few very simple signatures right here today to absolutely ensure all your wealth is perfectly protected and properly managed by Natalie. Shall we proceed now?" The heavy mahogany table seemed to stretch for miles, an altar built for the sacrifice of our lives. Julian Vance smiled his predatory, perfectly practiced smile, waiting for the final act of our destruction to be finalized with a few strokes of ink. Natalie moved with the eager, trembling anticipation of a vulture finally descending upon its wounded prey. She reached gracefully into her expensive designer handbag and pulled out a heavy polished black Mont Blanc fountain pen. It was a beautiful, terribly expensive writing instrument, precisely the kind of status symbol she felt she inherently deserved to wield. She uncapped it with a soft metallic click that echoed sharply against the thick glass windows of the high-rise conference room. She leaned over my shoulder, her expensive floral perfume washing over me in a sickening, suffocating wave. She gently pressed the cool gold-plated barrel of the pen directly into my shaking right hand. "Just sign right on those brightly colored sticky tab, Pops," she cooed, her voice dripping with that unbearable artificial sweetness. "It will only take a second, and then we can go get some ice cream to celebrate." I held the heavy Mont Blanc pen between my trembling fingers. I stared down at the thick stack of legal documents resting on the polished wood surface. The bold black lettering demanded my total surrender. It demanded my wealth, my autonomy, my dignity, and my physical freedom. The room fell into a heavy, expectant silence. Julian watched me with a look of mild, patronizing boredom, completely convinced that the senile old fool was simply struggling to remember how to spell his own name. Natalie kept her manicured hand resting lightly on the back of my leather chair, a subtle physical reminder of her absolute control over my reality. The silence stretched, expanding, until it felt thick enough to physically grasp. I listened to the steady, rhythmic hum of the central air conditioning system overhead. I felt the smooth, cold resin of the pen warming against my skin. And then in one smooth, deliberate motion, I let the grand performance come to a complete and total end. The violent, practiced tremor in my right hand instantly vanished. My fingers gripped the black barrel of the pen with absolute unwavering steadiness. I slowly rolled my shoulders backward, feeling the joints pop and settle as I intentionally shed the hunched, defeated posture of a broken dementia patient. I straightened my spine, sitting up to my full imposing height in the plush leather chair. I took a deep, steadying breath, allowing the sharp, clear focus of a man who had ruthlessly conquered the global logistics industry to flood back into my veins. I slowly turned my head and looked directly up at Natalie. I did not offer her the blank, glazed stare of a confused victim. I leveled my gaze at her, my eyes narrowing into a cold, hardened glare of pure, unforgiving steel. I looked at her with the sharp, ruthless eyes of a corporate titan who had just caught a thief with her hands buried deep inside the company vault. The confident, victorious smile plastered across Natalie's face instantly froze. The artificial warmth entirely drained from her dark eyes, rapidly replaced by a sudden, profound confusion. She blinked rapidly, her mind violently struggling to process the impossible physical transformation happening right in front of her. The drooling, pathetic old man she had been actively mocking in the car ride over had completely evaporated, replaced by a formidable adversary she had severely underestimated. Julian sensed the sudden, drastic shift in the room atmosphere. He sat forward in his chair, his patronizing expression instantly hardening into a mask of cautious concern. He opened his mouth to speak, likely to offer some smooth, manipulative legal reassurance, but I did not give him the opportunity to utter a single syllable. I raised my right hand, holding the expensive Mont Blanc pen high above the mahogany table. I looked Natalie dead in the eyes, ensuring she felt the absolute crushing weight of my unadulterated contempt. I slowly opened my fingers. The heavy metal pen plummeted downward, striking the solid wooden table with a sharp, violent crack that echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. The expensive black ink splattered across the pristine white pages of the medical conservatorship order, permanently ruining the fraudulent documents. "I do not think I will be signing that today, Natalie," I said, my voice resonating with a deep, booming authority that commanded the entire room. "I do not think I will be signing anything for you ever again." Natalie physically recoiled, stumbling backward a full step as if I had suddenly struck her across the face. She bumped into the edge of the conference table, her mouth opening and closing in absolute stunned silence. Julian instantly shot out of his chair, his face turning a dark, dangerous shade of crimson. "Now listen here," Julian snapped, completely dropping his compassionate facade. "You are highly confused, and you are legally required to finalize these protective measures for your own personal safety." He reached aggressively across the table, attempting to gather the ruined paperwork, but the surprises were far from over. Before Julian could even touch the stack of documents, the heavy leather chair next to me abruptly scraped backward against the floor. Derek, who had been sitting with his head slumped against his chest in a perfect simulation of a chemical stupor, suddenly sat up perfectly straight. The sluggish, lethargic demeanor completely vanished from his posture. He squared his broad shoulders, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscles visibly rippled beneath his skin. The thick, toxic fog had been entirely banished from his system, and the man sitting next to me was fully awake, incredibly focused, and burning with a righteous, devastating fury. He looked directly at his wife, his eyes completely devoid of the love and trust he had freely given her for years. Those eyes were now cold, hollow, and filled with a terrifying, absolute clarity. "Neither will I, you parasitic fraud," Derek stated, his voice a low, dangerous growl that vibrated with raw, unfiltered anger. "I know exactly what you have been putting in my morning drinks. I know about the offshore accounts. I know about your fake event planning company. And I know absolutely everything about Julian." Natalie let out a strangled, breathless gasp. Her hands flew to her face, her eyes widening in sheer, unadulterated terror. The blood completely drained from her sharp features, leaving her skin looking like cracked white porcelain. The magnificent, impenetrable illusion she had spent years meticulously building around our family had just spectacularly shattered into a million jagged pieces. Julian froze his hands, hovering uselessly over the ruined legal documents. He looked wildly around the conference room, the desperate, trapped expression of a cornered criminal suddenly washing over his handsome face. He knew instantly that the elaborate, multi-million-dollar money laundering syndicate they had expertly operated from the shadows was completely undeniably exposed. The suffocating, heavy silence in the high-rise office was abruptly and violently shattered by a loud, authoritative commotion erupting out in the reception area. Heavy booted footsteps pounded rapidly against the polished hardwood floors, advancing with aggressive, undeniable purpose. Natalie spun around, her chest heaving with frantic, panicked breaths, staring blindly at the frosted glass double doors. Julian took a rapid step backward, his eyes darting desperately toward the massive windows, searching for an impossible escape route. The brass handles of the conference room violently turned. The heavy double doors swung open with a massive, deafening crash, hitting the interior walls with a force that rattled the expensive paintings. It was not the polite, quiet receptionist bringing us a fresh pitcher of iced water. It was Sarah Jenkins. She strode confidently into the center of the room, her sharp business suit perfectly pressed her expression, radiating a cold, triumphant, and absolutely merciless legal authority. She did not come alone. Flanking her on both sides, pouring into the sleek conference room with tactical, overwhelming precision, were 4 heavily armed federal agents. They wore dark tactical vests, clearly emblazoned with the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, specifically attached to the elite white-collar Financial Crimes Division. The agents instantly fanned out their hands, resting securely on their utility belts, establishing total physical dominance over the confined space. The trap had not just closed on Natalie and Julian, it had violently crushed them. Sarah stopped directly at the head of the table, looking down at the two terrified criminals with a dark, satisfied smile. Sarah did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. She reached into her sleek leather briefcase and forcefully slammed a thick, heavily tabbed folder directly onto the polished mahogany surface. The sharp, resounding slap echoed through the massive conference room, severing the last lingering threads of Julian and Natalie, completely fabricated authority. "This is a certified comprehensive toxicology report," Sarah announced, her voice ringing out with absolute undeniable clarity. "It details the exact highly dangerous concentrations of unprescribed sedatives, powerful muscle relaxants, and dangerous neurotoxins that you have been systematically slipping into your husband's daily morning beverages for the past 7 months. Natalie physically recoiled, her back pressing hard against the expensive leather chair, as if the manila folder itself were radiating intense heat. Sarah did not stop. She pulled out a second, equally thick stack of heavily printed documents and tossed them right next to the medical records. "These are the complete unredacted transcripts from the cloned burner phone you so carelessly thought was secure." Sarah continued, her eyes locking onto Natalie, pale, terrified face. "We have every single text message, every encrypted digital communication, and every recorded phone call, coordinating the deliberate poisoning of Derek Stanton and the subsequent financial assassination of his entire estate." Sarah then turned her sharp, uncompromising gaze toward Julian, who was currently pressing his back against the glass window, looking frantically for an escape route that simply did not exist. Finally, she produced a third, massively thick binder bound in heavy black plastic. "And this, Mr. Vance, is the complete, undeniably traced money laundering paper trail. We have fully documented every single wire transfer, every offshore shell company and corporation, and every entirely fraudulent invoice generated by your fake event planning syndicate. We know exactly where the money went, how you washed it, and how you intended to frame this innocent man for your federal crimes." The heavy, suffocating silence that followed Sarah's devastating presentation was almost entirely physical. Julian's mouth opened and closed silently, like a fish pulled violently from the water. He raised his hands in a weak, pathetic gesture of surrender, his sophisticated, arrogant lawyer persona completely evaporating into the cold, recycled air of the high-rise office. The lead Federal Bureau of Investigation agent stepped forward. He was a tall, incredibly broad man, with a stern, deeply weathered face that had clearly seen decades of desperate criminals attempt to lie their way out of a concrete prison cell. Natalie Stanton and Julian Vance, the agent, stated, his deep voice carrying the absolute uncompromising weight of the federal government. "You are both under formal arrest for highly coordinated multi-million-dollar wire fraud, aggressive attempted extortion, severe medical endangerment, and federal criminal conspiracy to commit massive financial theft." The agent signaled to his highly trained team. 3 heavily armed officers immediately moved forward with precise tactical efficiency. They smoothly bypassed the massive mahogany conference table and descended upon the 2 terrified predators. Julian did not offer a single ounce of physical resistance. He simply lowered his head, utterly defeated, as an agent roughly grabbed his expensive suit jacket, spun him around, and forcefully pushed his hands behind his back. The sharp, metallic ratcheting sound of heavy steel handcuffs locking tightly around Julian's wrists echoed loudly in the quiet room, serving as the definitive, undeniable conclusion to his pathetic criminal career. But Natalie did not surrender with the same quiet, cowardly resignation. As the second federal agent reached out to grasp her arms, her magnificent, carefully cultivated socialite, illusion completely and spectacularly shattered. She let out a piercing, high-pitched scream that violently tore through the sterile corporate atmosphere, She twisted her body, desperately thrashing against the agent firm, unyielding grip. "No," she shrieked, hot, frantic tears instantly flooding her perfectly made-up face, leaving dark, messy streaks of black mascara running down her pale cheeks. "You cannot do this. You have no right to do this. I am his wife. I am a Stanton." The agent ignored her frantic screaming, expertly securing her wrists behind her back with a pair of heavy metal cuffs. Realizing that the federal authorities were entirely immune to her toxic manipulation, Natalie completely shifted her desperate tactics. She twisted her upper body, straining against the heavy steel restraints, and locked her wide, panicked eyes directly onto my son. "Derek," sobbed, her voice cracking with a forced, pathetic vulnerability that she had successfully used to control him for years. "Derek, my sweet husband, please, you have to stop them. You have to tell them this is all a massive, terrible misunderstanding. I love you. I was only trying to protect our family wealth. Your father is sick, his mind is gone, and he is making all of this up to destroy our beautiful marriage. Please, Derek, do not let them take me away. I am your wife. You know I would never ever hurt you. Please save me." Derek did not flinch. He did not look away. He sat perfectly still in the plush leather chair, his broad shoulders squared and his back rigid. He stared at the thrashing, weeping woman who had spent the last 7 months systematically destroying his mind and heavily draining his life force. The profound, heartbreaking grief that had overwhelmed him in the dark garage the previous night had completely burned away, leaving absolutely nothing behind but a cold, impenetrable wall of solid ice. He slowly stood up from the mahogany table, looking down at Natalie with a level of absolute, unfiltered disgust that made the entire room feel 10 degrees colder. "You drugged me," Derek stated, his voice a low, terrifyingly calm rumble that cut effortlessly through her hysterical, pathetic sobbing. "You slowly, deliberately poisoned me every single morning while smiling directly into my face. You tried to permanently cage my father in a locked medical ward. You actively planned to let me rot in a federal penitentiary for the rest of my natural life, just so you could steal my money and run away with a disbarred fraud." Derek took a slow, deliberate step closer to her, ensuring she could clearly see the total, irreversible death of his love. "You are absolutely nothing to me anymore," he whispered, his tone carrying the heavy, definitive weight of a closing tomb. "You are completely, permanently dead to me." Natalie collapsed to her knee, wailing loudly as the federal agents hauled her upward toward the door. I did not yell at her. I did not offer a single gloating remark. I calmly stood up smoothly, buttoned the front of my tailored suit jacket, and meticulously adjusted my silver cufflinks. I silently looked down at Natalie, watching the heavy metal handcuffs tightly bind the deceitful hands that had poured toxic poison into my home. The chaotic, deafening noise of her desperate, pathetic screaming slowly faded into the absolute background. "You underestimated the entirely wrong old man," I said quietly, my voice perfectly steady and cold. I finally turned my back on her complete and utter ruin. Derek and I walked out of the thick glass doors together, stepping bravely forward into the bright, incredibly promising sunlight of our newly reclaimed lives. Exactly 3 months have passed since that incredibly fateful morning in Julian Vance's downtown office. The heavy dust has finally settled, leaving behind a profound, enduring clarity. Natalie and Julian are currently sitting in separate, highly secured federal holding facilities, anxiously awaiting their upcoming criminal trials. The federal judges denied both of their requests for bail, citing the overwhelming severity of the extensive wire fraud and the undeniable flight risk associated with their massive network of hidden offshore accounts. Their complex, multi-million-dollar syndicate was completely dismantled, and their stolen assets were swiftly frozen. The arrogant smugness Natalie once wore like a designer dress has been permanently stripped away, replaced by the cold, harsh reality of a concrete cage. She tried to plea bargain desperately, attempting to trade Julian for a lighter sentence, But Sarah Jenkins had already provided the federal prosecutors with every single piece of damning evidence they would ever need. They have absolutely no leverage left. The sprawling $3 million mansion that was once my luxurious prison is now firmly and legally back under my exclusive name. I had my legal team ruthlessly purge every trace of her existence from the property records. We hired professional crews to clear out her expensive wardrobe, her pretentious decorations, and the lingering scent of her floral perfume. The house finally feels clean again. It feels like a home rather than a gilded trap designed to slowly suffocate us. But the most important victory is not financial. It is the remarkable recovery of my son. Derek has officially completed his rigorous medical detox program. The heavy sedatives and dangerous neurotoxins are completely flushed from his bloodstream. He is attending intensive therapy sessions several times a week, actively processing the profound trauma of being systematically poisoned by the woman he trusted implicitly. The healing process has been incredibly painful, requiring him to confront the darkest corners of betrayal. But he is facing it with immense courage. He is steadily rebuilding his shattered life and his professional career without the heavy toxic anchor of his ex-wife dragging him downward. He has returned to the logistics company, stepping back into his executive role with a renewed fierce determination. The hollow, vacant stare that once haunted his eyes has been entirely replaced by a sharp, unyielding focus. This afternoon, the warm Texas sun is shining brightly across the manicured backyard. I am sitting with Derek on the stone patio, enjoying the quiet, undisturbed peace of the sprawling estate. There are absolutely no toxic, bright green smoothies resting on the glass table. Instead, we are both drinking strong, real black coffee from heavy ceramic mugs. The rich, bitter aroma fills the air, grounding us in the present moment. Derek takes a slow sip, looking out over the shimmering swimming pool and the dense oak trees lining the property boundary. He turns to look at me, his expression softening with immense gratitude. The bond between father and son is infinitely stronger than it ever was before. We have walked through the absolute darkest valley of deception together. We stood shoulder to shoulder against a ruthless, calculating enemy who sought to destroy everything we held dear. We survived the devastating fire, and we emerged from the ashes with our minds, our wealth, and our freedom entirely intact. I take a long drink from my mug, feeling the heat spread comfortingly through my chest. I watch a small hawk circle high above the trees, scanning the ground below. I know that my vast legacy is finally safe. The logistics empire I sacrificed decades to build will remain securely in the Stanton family name. Derek will eventually take the reins, leading the corporation with the same unyielding strength and sharp insight that saved his life. The terrible nightmare is officially over. I lean back in my chair, closing my eyes for a brief, peaceful moment. I listen to the gentle rustling of the leaves and the steady breathing of my healthy son sitting beside me. The heavy burden I carried for months, the constant vigilance and exhausting performance has entirely lifted from my shoulders. I had successfully protected my bloodline from a ruthless predator. I had outsmarted a dangerous syndicate that believed I was nothing more than a discarded broken relic. They will spend the rest of their miserable lives locked away in concrete cells, regretting the day they ever targeted the Stanton estate. We won, Derek says softly, breaking the comfortable silence. I open my eyes and look at my boy. Yes, we did, I reply. We absolutely won everything. The future is now entirely ours to build. I take another sip of the strong coffee, feeling completely alive. It is over. The wolves are caged, and the lion remains the undisputed king of his domain. Never mistake silence for ignorance, and never assume that age equates to weakness. The greatest threat to a predator is an observant protector who knows how to patiently bide his time. Family is supposed to be your ultimate sanctuary, but when malicious greed infects your home, you must have the courage to cut the rot out by the root, no matter who it is. True power is not shown through loud, chaotic arguments. It is executed through quiet, calculated, and undeniable action. Protect your legacy, guard your mind, and always trust your gut feeling above all other outside noise today. If this story resonated with you today, please hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of justice and resilience. Have you ever had to outsmart someone who greatly underestimated you? Share your unique story in the comments below because I read every single one. Stay sharp and safe.